Hi everyone and welcome to this video where Raymond and I, the IT bros, at least in the Netherlands we're known for that, are interviewing Eric Woodruff right here. And Eric, well, I've known you from Semperis, but you also work for Microsoft, and I'm wondering what you're doing at Semperis today.
Yeah, so right now I work on our security research team as a senior security researcher, mostly focused on Entra security, looking for indicators of exposure, indicators of compromise, right? So security posture around Entra is my focus, but our focus is Active Directory and Entra, so.
So during the day, I am architect, just like my buddy Ray for large organizations, but I also do some product ownership, some product management for Enow software for their application governance Accelerator solution, which is a service that allows you to check your enterprise applications and app registrations in Entra. And this is something close to my heart because I see Entra applications misconfigured a lot, just like you did, Eric, with UnOAuthrized, which you presented on during Black Hat.
Yeah, that's correct. And so, with unauthorized, which is a mouthful, it was it's sort of Microsoft specific vulnerability with a Microsoft specific fix. But that being said, one of the things, I've been asked by a lot of people who saw the presentation or have read the blog, asking if there's similar ways that they could sort of create the same problem. And yeah, app misconfigurations are a hot topic in Entra right now. So,
Okay, well, Eric, now many people listening to this interview will now start wondering what is unauthorized and what exactly did you find?
so unauthorized, and it's a bit of a play on OAuth and OAuth scopes, which are effectively permissions for applications in Entra. And the finding for unauthorized was actually a few different things, but essentially, I guess I'll give the sort of background on app registrations and service principles. So, right, when you're developing software that you want other customers to consume in the Entra world, you create an app registration, and on it you define the scopes, right, the permissions that you need, right? So, user read write all, or group create and things like that. You define and But then when the consuming tenant, right, I want to buy the software the developer has, I go through an admin consent grant where I agree to allow those permissions sort of exist in my tenant, and those are on a service principal, right? So there's this, many to one, right? One app registration to many service principals, whoever's consuming it, relationship. So Microsoft operates in a very similar way, right? So your Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, the Azure portal. There's hundreds and hundreds of service principals and tenants for Microsoft applications.
That you did no admin consent to.
Correct. Yep. So, and I think actually someone has blogged about this because they were looking at the sort of interesting bit where right, Microsoft applications, as you start to consume them, will create service principals, and yes, they're the one thing you don't have to consent to. Right, and I understand that like the stuff wouldn't work if you had to, but with unauthorized, the thing is there's been a lot of research, sort of in the area of service principals and trying to abuse them, and do all sorts of things like lateral movement and privilege elevation and all that, and so I was sort of profiling applications in Entra, which in itself isn't that unique. And there's a lot of other researchers out there who have looked at this. I think in particular, Dirk-Jan Malema, in 2019, he had, blogged about this. And Microsoft has actually reduced the ability since then to assign credentials to service principals for Microsoft applications, but there was still like this list of like 9. And that list itself wasn't sort of unique, but I guess where I differed from other folks is I decided to try to do things that would be considered, privileged anyways, and I found some interesting stuff.
So you kind of broke the system?
I don't know if I broke the system, but I found, I guess I found the secret, right? So, or some secret. So the most sort of offensive thing I'd say I found was, so device registration service, which as a service principal and pretty much any tenant, found that if you assign credentials to it on the service principal, that you would have been able to manage any role in Entra, right? And so, as an application administrator or cloud app administrator, while you have certain permissions to do privileged things in Entra, you don't have the ability, like in a greenfield new tenant that you haven't shot yourself in the foot with as a customer. To be able to manage roles, right? And this is a way that you could sort of get around that barrier. So, and then also Viva Engage, which was Yammer for like the 3 people that use it. No offense to the Yammer folks. Found that you could delete and permanently delete any user in the tenant, again, including global admins, right? Which is something an application administrator should not be allowed to do. And then you could also, with rights management service, create users in the tenant, which again, right, an app admin sort of in a new greenfield tenant shouldn't be able to create users unless they're given some other role to do that.
So those were some interesting findings. And what happened when you found them? You went to Microsoft and they told you that those were like undocumented features?
Yeah, so when I first opened the case in the beginning of January 2024, they first came back and said it was all sort of low severity. And so then I wrote a big long email to them, like documenting specific sort of like attack paths that I see, right? Again, trying to be very clear that I get that if you onboard other applications, you may create paths where an app admin, right, could do things. And we know that app admins are privileged users, but in a new tenant, you shouldn't be able to do this stuff. And so I wrote this up, and then I basically, in sort of as it seems to go with MSRC, didn't hear anything for about a month. And then I just get an email out of the blue that like the device registration service problem has been resolved, and like asking me to go verify and get the bounty sort of review email and stuff. So
Okay.
yep.
So we're not really talking about undocumented features, but we are talking, at least for a bit, about undocumented vulnerabilities. Because when you talk to Microsoft still made the decision not to provide CVEs for vulnerabilities in their Microsoft Cloud services, just for their on-prem products and things that are typically run on customers' iron. Did that hurt talking to Microsoft? Did that hurt talking to others about these vulnerabilities? Was there overlap perhaps between certain things because of that? Or was it a pleasant experience anyway?
I don't know if I would have benefited from having a CV. I mean, I think talking with other researchers who have more focused on the Active Directory world of things, I don't get the impression that it's any easier for them to sort of talk about the stuff with CVEs. And you'll see cases where one researcher will submit something to Microsoft and they'll kind of say working as designed, and then someone else will submit it where it's like 99% the same, yet then like all of a sudden it's like a bigger thing. I mean, I will say at Black Hat, I had the opportunity to talk with MSRC, and actually the security researcher on Microsoft's side who was sort of working the case having the conversation with him, like, I don't want to sort of give away the conversation to be respectful to him, but
But you definitely had the feeling that it was more off the record, I guess.
yeah, well, I would just say though, I think I've worn lots of hats over the years, and have been on, all the different sides of the fence. And I guess I'll say, talking with him could understand why it took so long. I mean, I certainly had feedback for MSRC where, like me personally, even if there's no change, like just hearing from you saying like, hey, there's been no change, right? We're still working on it, instead of it just seeming like it's like a black hole, would be nice. But I certainly understood more of why it was taking them so long to fix things. In particular, because the way they chose to sort of look at this when I submitted my findings after they started to take it serious, it seemed like they were looking at other stuff, which he didn't really sort of like say what that was. But it seems like it had a cascading effect because this list of like 9 service principals you could assign secrets to has been reduced even sort of beyond like the things I submitted to them. So I think also it had them sort of like double checking, other authorization models and stuff. Again, right, probably trying to make sure that there wasn't anything maybe that I didn't happen on that now they have this idea, right, and they're sort of making sure that they're going to find something else.
So you've presented the unauthorized findings on Black Hat.
Yep.
You're scheduled for many more talks in the next coming weeks.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you have the feeling that you're talking to the right people, or presenting to the right people, the people that could actually do something about this in their organization, that they would be the right problem owner, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say in general, just I actually really like speaking at security conferences. Even previously spoken at things like B-Sides, and there's a lot of them in the U.S. I think that identity is an area in security that it's funny because, right, we say like identity is the new security perimeter, but when you actually talk with a lot of like security people, they don't really understand identity. So I like the opportunity to have identity conversations with security folks, and to try to bring these topics up, because I will say, from giving the presentation at Black Hat, have had a lot of questions from people around, like, again, like, could this impact other applications? Like, no, because this was a very Microsoft specific thing. But then, like, could we create scenarios where we could sort of mimic these findings? And it's like, yes, you could. And right, from auditing organizations, I don't know about you guys, but I found that a lot of organizations do create these paths, and they don't know that they're doing it. So as an opportunity, I think, to actually help educate people, like, I think it's any audience to me is great. So
Yeah, so with the Enow software application governance accelerated solutions, we are providing the people with these challenges, the problem owners for Entra application security, the means, the insights, the reports on typical application misconfigurations. And we're talking about API permissions that could be used to escalate all the way up to global admin. We're talking about public flows. We're talking about certificates. Even though they went from secrets to certificates, they have certificates with a validity period of 20 years, for instance, which is bonkers if you ask me. And we try to surface all that to these admins, but I can imagine that they're still feeling pretty overwhelmed in this area.
yeah, I mean, I think it's, well, I'll say, right, I mean, sort of in that area with some of our products, we do, right, these things where, right, you try to surface the problems. I mean, honestly, in my opinion, it's as much as trying to give whoever's consuming this data, who likely may or may not be an expert in Entra or identity, a really clear path to resolution, right? Like, because you'll see a smattering of I guess I'd say insecurity over times and products. And when I worked at Microsoft, right, you'd have findings on things and you don't even know, like, right, you're the one who's trying to help the customer and you're like, I don't even know what this thing is, right? And I mean, you then have the obligation to go dig, but I'll say just like I love education and educating people. And I think seeing that stuff sort of end up in products where you're helping people really understand why this finding is important, can go a long way instead of just saying like, this is bad, right? And like, sort of like, some products, it almost feels like it's like shaming people, right? And honestly, right, I mean, I've been an IT pro, right? You're just trying to get stuff done so you like don't get fired, right? So I don't fault a lot of the people that have created these misconfigurations because it's so complex. There's so many knobs and dials out there in identity in an Entra to configure. There's so many ways that you can misconfigure things, and you're not trying to do it on purpose.
So you already mentioned that the IT pro is probably one side of the issue. The security people are the other side of the issue.
Don't forget about developers.
Yes.
Okay, the developers. Yeah, sure. Is there a general lack of knowledge in all those areas currently, you think?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, I don't think businesses generally afford people the time to learn or understand, right? And you'll see a lot of businesses who will, say like, "Oh, we'll give you all this time for training and this and that," but that's not the reality when you actually go work there. So,
Nope.
yeah.
And I guess we also should not forget the fact that managing application access in Entra is wildly different
Yep.
from managing application access in good old Active Directory. So the question then is, are we on the same path? Or does Entra give us more dials and knobs to avoid giving some VIP with some problem domain admin privileges?
Well, I mean, I worked at a place where our CTO had global admin because he was the CTO. So, right, those problems seem to be a challenge amongst themselves. I think we're going to see a mix of history repeating itself in Entra, and I think we'll also see new problems, right? Because we're talking OpenID Connect and OAuth and well, I mean, SAML, right? SAML, I feel like is the one thing. I mean, if you stick ADFS onto Active Directory, right, it's kind of the one thing that exists between both. And even as a huge SAML nerd, as maybe sad as that sounds, right, it's been around for almost 20 years, and there's a lot of people who still don't understand it. So this probably sounds very depressing and pessimistic or whatnot, but
Well, I still remember SAML being introduced in ADFS and Microsoft touting it as the way forward for collaboration between two organizations. And it turned out that it was the perfect way to get access to SaaS applications or applications hosted by others, not just functionality like some web app that you both just wanted to use.
yeah, I mean, well, I think it gets into, well, I think I'll say with the cloud, I think the scary part is that to some degree with Active Directory, or at least in the older days, right, we'd wrap everything in firewalls and it could kind of be a dump, but it was sort of a protected dump, right? And now with SaaS applications in the cloud, like, I mean, everything's just out there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. With eventually, I think the attackers are going to increase going after, Microsoft 365 and Entra, and we know they already are. I think
Yes.
it doesn't get as much coverage out there as like the Active Directory attacks, but
Well, I hear two words ringing in my customers' ears that specifically get them to pay attention, which are the words midnight and blizzard.
Yep. Yep.
Yep, or APT 29, or Nobelium, as they were also known as. But I'm trying to find a way how to make this better, and the only way that I can see is Microsoft or a third party providing a way to undo changes to applications. I feel that most Entra admins these days, they're hesitant to making changes to applications, not deleting them, because there's soft delete in Entra. If you delete an application, you can just get it back. But undo changes to applications is tricky. And I think I can count on one hand the number of third-party solutions that offer backup and restore of every attribute, if any, for enterprise applications and app registrations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you definitely have, right, like challenges around, well, like, talking about certificates that are valid for 20 years, right? I think secret management, credential management is, it's like this weird combination of maybe lazy, maybe, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, where it's like, well, if we get it to work with the credentials, right, as long as they work until I retire, then that's like the goal here, right? No, and you can't back up and restore these things the same way that maybe you could with Active Directory, right? Because we're limited to whatever primarily graph is exposing. I know there's other APIs, both deprecated Azure AD Graph, and then there's like the secret API that the portal still uses.
Well, let's make sure we name that first API correctly, because it's not even the Azure AD API. It's still labeled Windows Azure Active Directory API, and Microsoft is deprecating that stuff, and people that are using the app and that functionality, probably in some wildly popular people picker piece of code, they'll get errors coming their way soon. So yeah, it's the same with ADEL versus MSAL for the authentication libraries. It's the same with the PowerShell commandlets. We're going to see the same thing with license management going from the Entra portal to the Microsoft 365 admin portal. It's challenging to keep up.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you can work in it all day, and I feel like it's still challenging to keep up.
I still feel like a novice every day. Yeah. So if you could give a tip to a starting Entra admin, what would it be?
Just one. Man, I mean, honestly, I'd say take the SC300 and actually understand it. I mean, I honestly though recommend the SC300 to anyone that works in security, because I think you need to understand identity regardless of where you are. And just know that Entra is tough, right? I mean, again, I've been working with it through different roles for about 10 years now, and I would only say in the past maybe 3 or 4 that I feel like I really had sort of a mostly mastery of even the core of it, right? And they keep adding new things on, right? We get private access, and I'm like, you get verified credentials, and but I mean, there's so much they're gluing on, which is great, but it's really hard to keep up with it all. So
that's probably the big difference with the good old days with AD.
Yep.
We got AD in 1998, and it hardly changed over those 25 years it's been there. And now we have Entra, which used to be called Azure AD. And it's still changing. It's not just the name. It's the whole product is.
Well,
moving.
what tip would you give him?
What tip I would give the new Entra administrator? Whoa! First, learn AD.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, or at least ADFS. Because it's the same protocols, mainly.
I mean, there's so many. I'd say I could see where you're going. There's so many hybrid organizations, right? I mean, unless you're a startup, any enterprise is still hybrid. And actually, that made me think of. I know when I was helping mentor some people that were starting at Microsoft, who had like masters in cybersecurity degrees, they knew nothing about Active Directory. So I think that's a great answer.
I think
about-
it's this like of ground level knowledge that you require to understand what's going on in Entra.
What about you?
So I learned Active Directory from John Saville. And John Saville has a YouTube channel. It's free. And he explains everything on Entra and Azure.
Yeah.
There's John Craddock on YouTube. There's Annie Malone on YouTube. I'm a huge podcast fan. You probably all know what my favorite podcast is. It's the IT Bros podcast. Obviously, people. But I don't find good podcasts on Entra yet. But there's tons of great value on YouTube.
Yeah, true.
And luckily, I think most new Entra admins are of that YouTube generation. So they'll just slide in. I'm not worried at all. So this interview was made possible by Enow Software and, of course, Semperis,
Yep.
your employer. Raymond and I are the Dutch IT bros, and we want to thank you for watching our video. We want to thank you, Eric,
Thank you for
of
having
course,
me.
and we'll see you soon. Thank you.